For as long as I remember, I've always wanted to be a teacher.
The moment that when I entered school gates, I felt like home for me because I got love from the teachers.
My favorite teacher was Mr. Ali.
My teachers, they really played a big role in making me become who I am today.
One of the things that I think is amazing about student teachers who have gone through Teaching for All, it's this agency that I see seems to be emerging out of them.
The moment you join Teaching for All, it changes your perspective. You gain confidence to stand in front of a class and teach. There's a moment where you feel in control of the classroom. You have classroom management. Learners are with you.
Teaching for All as well teaches us how to involve, to build the relationship between the community. You cannot separate the school with the community because the behavior of the school is shaped by the behavior of the community.
Teaching for All encourages all teachers to listen to the needs of their learners and to also be flexible.
The fact that whether we like it or not, teaching is a calling of some sort. Not everybody will be a teacher. We may have all the degrees that you want, but we really need to interrogate the whole concept of who a teacher is and what does it mean to teach.
I would like to make every child in my classroom feel included.
Inclusive education can help to change our society.
As a young teacher, I'm really inspired to make a change for good.
Mangwanani, Abusheni, Molweni, Dumelang, Sanibonani. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to a very special event where the ethos of inclusive education, which so many in the teaching community aspire to, is given a powerful platform on which to grow and evolve in South Africa. Thank you for joining us. As we are all aware, 2020 has been a tremendously challenging year for educators, with a huge impact on teaching modalities. And so we are very excited to be concluding the academic year with a morning such as this, one that is filled with discourse and insights that provide a powerful path forward in ensuring inclusive education for all as a daily practice in our country, regardless of circumstance. And it gives me great pleasure to be your host today. My name is Malaika Mahlatsi, commonly known as Malaika wa Azania. I'm an activist, a writer, and a senior specialist researcher in the Office of the Executive Mayor in the C2F Ekurhuleni in the Gauteng province. This morning's event is titled Embedding Inclusive Education in Teacher Professional Development in South Africa, and it promises you a wonderfully positive journey into the future of inclusive education as part of the Teaching for All initiative. We have a dynamic program ahead, and we are delighted to share it with you. It includes an overview of the initial impact report on the Teaching for All program by Professor Yusuf Sayed, a visiting professor at the Institute for Social and Economic Research at Rhodes University in Makhanda, who has worked with universities across South Africa to produce this evaluation report, as well as a live Q&A with Professor Sayed, followed by a panel discussion. Of course, given that 2020 has been the year of online interaction, please remember to use the Teaching for All hashtag and to add your insights to our dialogue. Please, if you have any questions throughout the day, pop them in the question panel and we will address them at the end. We look forward to your engagement and to your interactions with us. Thank you again for joining us. With International Human Rights Day upon us, in a year where freedom of movement has been so severely restricted, it is wonderful to focus on putting real momentum behind a crucial human right that secures a constructive future for coming generations, the right to inclusive education for all. This is by no means an easy task, given the existing polarization and inequality prevalent in South African society, now deeply exacerbated by the devastating impact of the pandemic, particularly on the most marginalized people in our society. And it is here that the Teaching for All program has such an important role to play. The ultimate goal of the project is to ensure that meaningful attention is paid to the development of inclusive education competence for teachers through the teacher education programs offered by universities, as well as those offered to in-service teachers by provincial education departments. It is part of the ongoing work to strengthen teacher education in the country, And the strength of this project lies in its collaborative and co-development approach involving multiple partners in teacher education. Indeed, the Teaching for All project is part of the broader Teaching and Learning Development Capacity Improvement Program, which is generously supported by the European Union, with this particular aspect of the project being led and guided by the British Council in collaboration with MIET Africa, the Department of Basic Education, and the Department of Higher Education, Training, Science and Technology, the University of South Africa, and multiple other higher education institutional partners. And a huge thank you to all of them for the pathways that they're opening to inclusive education through multifaceted teacher skills development. Within this context, today's event focuses on launching the initial impact report on the Teaching for All project and to share some of its critical findings in embedding inclusive education as part of ongoing teacher training and professional development. Reading the report, I found innumerable usable insights, only some of which we will have time to delve into today. So I would strongly encourage you to engage with the full document at your leisure. It is filled with food for thought and geared towards stimulating a forward motion as we all engage in making inclusive education an everyday reality through our combined actions. Indeed, with the rising importance of transdisciplinarity in creating integrated approaches to countless complex challenges of human existence, this report truly opens up opportunities for further collective action based on its insight. Now, without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce 3 initial speakers to briefly welcome you via pre-recorded video messages. The first is Professor Bernard Ray, the Head of Cooperation in the EU in Africa, Dr. Granville Whittle, the Deputy Director General of Social Inclusion in the Department of Basic Education in South Africa, and Professor Nhlanhla Cyril Mbatha, Director of the Institute of Social and Economic Research at Rhodes University.
Good morning. Representatives of the Department of Higher Education and Training and Basic Education, professors, academics, representatives of universities, schools, think tanks, civil society organizations, colleagues, friends, it's a great pleasure to say a few words of welcome at this webinar of the Teaching for All project. The European Union places a great importance on supporting education and particularly inclusive education for primary school children in South Africa. Education plays a vital role in helping build inclusive and tolerant societies, as well as in equipping young people with the skills they need to be resilient and socially engaged citizens. Quality education that is accessible to all and is inclusive is also one of the most powerful and cost-efficient instruments we have to fight inequalities in society. Because of its importance for a country like South Africa, education features prominently in the strategy of the European Union cooperation with South Africa as one of its 3 priorities. Projects like the Teaching for All are crucial for the country, as they aim to give students who train to be teachers the tools and methods to become inclusive and therefore better teachers. A project like Teaching for All, where civil society, think tanks, universities, and government work together, is a practical example on how we can advance the Sustainable Development Agenda in the country. And teacher training for inclusivity is an important contribution to the education SDG, SDG 4. and it tackles several of the targets. SDG 4.5, eliminating all discrimination in the education system. 4.7, all learners acquire knowledge and skills. 4.4, increase the number of people who have the relevant skills. Or 4C, substantially increase the supply of qualified teachers. But in this month of December, we also celebrate human rights. And within Human Rights Month, every year, on the 3rd of December, we commemorate specifically the International Day for People with Disabilities. And this year, the theme is Building Back Better towards a disability-inclusive, accessible, and sustainable post-COVID-19 world. This theme is very much in line with the webinar of today, and the work conducted of the program in the framework of the Teaching for All project. As a matter of fact, inclusive education is definitely a main enabler to building back better for children with special education needs. Special education needs is a very broad term that refers to a very high number of children in the system. It's often seen that special education needs arises from physical or intellectual disability. However, special education needs can also arise from growing up in poverty, from insufficient language knowledge, trauma, or a combination of those factors, which may be permanent or temporary for the respective learner. Inclusive education looks at the potential instead of looking at the barrier and puts mechanisms in place to overcome any of those. December is the month when we celebrate human rights, and the right to education is part of these human rights. There is no doubt that quality education is an imperative. Quality education is intrinsically linked to skills development, employability, and economic growth. Quality education is therefore an elevator towards transformation and a more equal and cohesive society. Quality education is an investment towards social justice. And quality education for all means leaving no one behind. So let me end my brief remarks by thanking you for your engagement towards ensuring that each child has his or her right to education respected, thanks to quality teachers. The work you do changes the lives of children. This is the most worthy and noble cause, and I salute you and respect you for these efforts, commendable efforts. Please rest assured of the continued support of the European Union to the cause of inclusive education, human rights, the rights of people with disability, and we are looking forward to learn more today about how inclusive education and teacher training towards inclusivity are making progress in South Africa. I thank you very much. I wish you an excellent webinar. Goodbye.
My name is Granville Whittle. I am a Deputy Director General in the National Department of Basic Education. I'm responsible for sector care and support. Today is an important day for the department, but also for our entire sector, the education sector. This particular project, the Teaching for All, is an important milestone because it brings together some of the key partners in our sector, working collaboratively to achieve greater inclusion within our schools. The project, which was initiated in 2016, was led by the British Council with ourselves, the Department of Basic Education, the University of South Africa, and MIET Africa. This particular project was co-funded by the European Union, and we are grateful for their support in this particular endeavor. The project critically aimed to instill the skills, attitudes, and competencies in teachers that would allow them to function more effectively in an inclusive environment where there are diverse ranges of students that are participating. The approach of the course is intersectional, and it has a strong human rights focus. In fact, the South African Human Rights Commission has been part of this particular process as well. Working with our partners and our key stakeholders, the Teaching for All project has developed teacher training modules and teaching materials, both for the Bachelor of Education, as well as for the PGCE, the Postgraduate Certificate in Education. I'm very pleased that we have 10 of our South African universities that are currently offering the course, which is absolutely fantastic. And the course has to date reached more than 23,000 young teachers across the system. Of course, one of the challenges that we have now as a sector is to continue to expand the reach of the Teaching for All program to cover all of the other universities that are also offering a teacher education. I am particularly pleased that the program has now been evaluated, that the findings of that particular program is available, and that we can now take the lessons that we've learned and improve on what it is that the course is able to offer. Also, it's wonderful that alongside the formal teacher education course offered by the universities, we now have a SACE-endorsed inclusive education in-service training program for teachers that as a department, we obviously want to support in rolling out across the country. So in conclusion, let me congratulate the team that started off in 2016 for reaching this important milestone, and also to thank very much the European Union for funding this particular initiative. I also want to thank CITE, the Center for International Teacher Education at the CPUT, for the evaluation that they've conducted. In particular, thank Professor Yusuf Sayed for his leadership in this particular program. The importance of collaboration of these kinds of endeavors cannot be underestimated. This project brought together civil society, academia, and government departments. And it is this kind of collaboration that I think we need to encourage, not only in the education sector, but in fact, in our country. Thank you very much.
The Director of the Institute of Social and Economic Research at Rhodes University. With all protocol observed, greetings from the city of Makhanda in South Africa. It is a great honor and responsibility for the Institute of Social and Economic Research at Rhodes University to have been involved and contracted to lead the execution of this element of the crucial research on training and development of teachers in South Africa. Education remains at the center of both human and economic development efforts globally, and specifically in post-colonial countries, where teachers are the custodians of national development projects. As demonstrated in this research program, efforts to mainstreaming inclusive education are crucial for producing quality teachers through avenues including the development of sound education materials, other resources, and the establishment of partnerships. The impact of this research project should be evident in its reach, where a reported 23,000 or so student teachers at 10 different higher education institutions across South Africa have benefited. Where also more than 80 lecturers were involved in the delivery of the project. When all of the 23,000 student teachers begin their teaching careers, more than 766 schools will benefit from this model of inclusive education. The adaptive implementation strategy of the project should also ensure that there would be local ownership of the meanings, understandings of what accounts as inclusive education and pedagogy in different contexts. This should then support the long-term sustainability of the benefits and impacts coming from this research. The Institute of Social and Economic Research at Rhodes University would like to sincerely thank the initiators, funders, the research team led by Professor Syed and all the implementing partners on embarking on this research journey for the benefit of South Africa, South African teachers specifically, and more importantly, its learners. We hope that other aspects of this education research program continue in the country and also spread to other parts of the African continent for comparative analysis and cross-learning activities, and that our institute remains part of that journey. Thank you and good luck with the launch of the report and the future sharing of its content with as many stakeholders as possible. Thank you.
Thank you to our speakers. It has been so heartening to see how the Teaching for All program truly advocates the idea of inclusive classrooms being the best possible learning environment for all learners, places that scaffold social and life skills through to adulthood beyond just academic learning. And it is indeed inspiring to see this manifest in practice, with the project supporting teachers to be trained and equipped with the skills needed to maximize the benefits of diverse classrooms. Ultimately, it is critical capacity building that this project is all about, both for pre-service and in-service teachers, facilitating the integration of newly developed inclusive education training modules, materials, workshops, and activities into universities and provincial education departments. The materials are intended to be delivered in a mix of online and face-to-face training, or purely online via distance learning. Today, thus, is dedicated to sharing the early evaluation of how these noble intentions are translating into implementation and are delivering on their intended outcomes in the early phases of the project, with key insights for future action. And for this, we now welcome Professor Yusuf Syed, a visiting professor at the Institute for Social and Economic Research at Rhodes University, who drafted the report Embedding Inclusive Education in Teacher Professional Development in South Africa, an evaluation of the impact of the Teaching for All project. Professor Syed will present his initial findings, and we will then open up the discussion in a Q&A with him, before then moving on to our panel discussion. All the material under discussion today will be provided to you, so all you need to do is sit back, take it all in, engage, reflect, and enjoy. For now, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me an absolute great pleasure to call on Professor Yusuf Syed to address you.
Thank you for those very kind words in introducing me. Just to recap who I am, I've been responsible as the principal investigator for the evaluation of the Teaching for All project. I'm very, very pleased to be here, and I welcome you all to the launch of the report and hopefully the start of a journey in which we embed inclusive education in South Africa. Do not worry about taking detailed notes or about the report. This will be all in a package of resources you get afterwards. So the advantage of joining this virtual seminar and launch is that you're going to get something afterwards. Just what I'm going to talk about is an overview of the presentation. In the time I've got, I'm going to start with briefly an overview of the Teaching for All project, moving on to how we conducted the evaluation and the theory we used for the evaluation. And then I'm going to talk about two key aspects of the evaluation. First is the evaluation we did of how the project managed to embed inclusive education in initial teacher education, and then how it prepared the system of continuing professional development for inclusive education. And lastly, I'll conclude by just synthesizing for you very briefly the key findings and the recommendations and way forward. I'm hoping that what I do in my presentation is simply give you an overview and whet your appetite for engaging deeply with the report and the range of resources and materials that accompany the report, as well as the materials that have been produced. Let me begin by just a brief overview of the Teaching for All project. In a sense, its starting point is a particular objective which seeks to build a more inclusive education system in South Africa by crucially improving the attitudes and capacity of the teachers who are going to become teachers in South Africa in the future and those who are already there in the system, to ensure that they're provided with the necessary skills, knowledge, and dispositions towards inclusive education so that they may realize inclusive education pedagogies in their schools and in their classroom. And thereby they become key agent for an inclusive education system. There are 4 key components of the project. Background research would inform the development of the materials, course materials produced, the materials being implemented, and the impact evaluation. So I'm at the tail end, and the work we've done as at the tail end of the process, where we're hopefully sharing with you today the key insights of the impact evaluation. A little bit more about the material and the project as a whole. At its core are teachers. And at its core are the agency of teachers, their ability to work, their ability to practice, their knowledge, their dispositions, and their values, such that they are provided with a set of tools, resources, and abilities to enact inclusive education pedagogy in the classroom. But the Teach for All project is just one of a suite of projects and programs initiated by the Department for Higher Education and Training as part of a core funding from the European Union for the Teaching and Development Capacity Improvement Program, of which there are multiple components, as you can see on the slide. It includes, for example, the Primary Teacher Education Project. The one we're talking about today is the Teacher Education for Inclusive Teaching Project and the Teacher Education for Special Needs Education Projects. But we focusing on, and our evaluation was the Teaching for All projects. Why was this project important and why is it so necessary? South Africa has an ambitious range of policies. We talk about that in detail in the report. But I'm going to mention one policy in particular. White Paper 6, which South Africa accepted and adopted as far back as 2001, said, in South Africa, we would like to transform the education system to effectively respond to and support learners, parents, and communities by promoting the removal of barriers to learning and participation. This is a fundamental educational commitment we made in 2001, and it links back fundamentally to the National Education Policy Act, which promised every South African the right to equitable and quality education, irrespective of race, religion, creed, or disability. And in that sense, what this project is doing is building on that tradition of that policy and supporting a range of policies, regulations, and interventions initiated by both the current Department of Basic Education and Department of Higher Education and Training to ensure that we realize that commitment. This includes the Policy on Screening, Identification, Assessment, and Support, STIAS, 2014. It also includes the recent white paper on the rights of persons with disability. In that sense, this project is seeking to realize our valued and valuable policy commitments we've made in different documents and regulations. And its theory of change is very straightforward and simple to an extent. It says, if we conduct certain activities such as research, we then provide the materials that teachers need. And the outcomes is when those materials are developed and embedded in inclusive education modules and training programs, both for initial education and continuing teacher professional development. We're likely to see teachers' self-confidence increasing. We're likely to see their knowledge increasing, and we're likely to see their skills and the ability to teach inclusively increasing. And were that to happen, we're likely to set South Africa on a path to a more inclusive education system. And that's what this evaluation is about. And that's what I'll be reporting now in the next part. But how did the project go about doing that? It created materials, and there were 4 units it created for initial teacher education as part of an integrated module. Unit 1 was inclusive teaching and learning for South Africa, moving on to inclusive teaching and learning for South Africa, then Unit 2 was learning diversity, Unit 3 was inclusive school communities, and Unit 4 was inclusive teaching and learning. These are a collection of units which are integrated because they provide foundationally the deep understanding of what inclusive education means conceptually, theoretically, and in terms of the policies, both in South Africa, in the region, and globally. And the last unit gets teachers, both intending teachers and current teachers, to think about how they might realize that in the classroom. But the materials were not only targeted at future teachers. Over the duration of the project, CPDT materials, which I mean continuing professional teacher development materials, were produced. These are available in a multiple range of formats. Offline modules using Spoodle, self-standing materials, and I'll talk about that later. But crucially, the materials were accompanied by resources, such as lecturer handbooks, videos, things which people can use in order to ensure that they further understand it. The implementation approach, which we write about extensively and we critically review in our report, talks about an adaptive theory of implementation. Because fundamentally what we witnessed in our evaluation was a model of implementation which was responsive to context, which was responsive to the dynamics of how higher education institution worked. And as such, it evolved over time. But fundamentally, it was driven by 4 key principles: consultation and ownership, particularly with those who are fundamentally delivering the program; capacity building of those who will be realizing the intentions of the project; alignment with other interventions, both within the EU project, but generally within South African education; and an implementation approach relying on evidence. The monitoring and evaluation work we did was both at the level of informing the process as it unraveled and unfolded, as well as conducting the impact evaluation. In the report, we talk about both elements. Our theory of evaluation that we sought to used in this study was to understand evaluation as a process, not just looking at how the evaluated program, what the outcomes of the evaluated programs were, but also how it works and how it sought to achieve its objectives. And crucially, we were seeking to use the evaluation as a way of drawing lessons that would contribute to improving future interventions of this kind or similar. In other words, we are trying to understand how the project has worked and why it has done so. And in terms of why it has done so, we provide some insights, but we call upon all the research community and others to do further work on understanding better why it has worked and why programs and projects such as these work in particular conditions. Our framework and understanding of inclusive education was that competence in inclusive education is a bundle of attributes which has to do with one's knowledge. So your knowledge about the curriculum, your knowledge about learners, your knowledge about inclusive education policy. It has to do with skills, your skills in how to teach, your skills in how to assess, your skills in how you understand, able to implement CS, and your disposition. What values do you hold about inclusive education? What beliefs do you hold about disabled learners? or learners with diverse sexual orientations. All of that occurs in context. So our choice and selection of institutions was an attempt to understand how different higher education institutions, for example, both residential as well as distance, took up the materials, because we believe fundamentally in evaluation terms that the utilization of the materials is impacted by the context in which it's occurring, by the people who do that, the lecturers, and by the materials itself. So let's go to initial teacher education. In a sense, in the materials, I'm going to broadly talk about it as an aggregate whole, aggregating both across distance and residential. But let's start with the basic facts and figures about the impact. In a very short space of time, the project reached about 22,000 teachers, give or take. And this is obviously numbers we generated from the institutions, including just about every provinces, including distance providers such as UNISA, residential providers such as University of Limpopo, Tshwane University of Technology, Cape Peninsula University of Technology, University of the Western Cape, and so on and so forth. Crucial to that is we selected a sample of institutions that we worked with and the project worked with for the impact and for the implementation that included universities of technology, traditional universities as they are called, and comprehensive. But more than that, it also worked with 86 lecturers and heads of departments of program, which is a substantial number. And we speak about that more in our report. In the report, we evaluate across the board how students felt about the materials, how they felt about the materials influencing their knowledge, skills, and dispositions, and how they felt about whether the materials and the programs within which the materials were integrated would make them as better teachers. So when we looked at the materials and the resources across both residential and distance education, generally students were very positive at the basic level of the design of materials. They felt that the units were logically arranged and structured. The materials are easy to use, but crucially, they found the activities, the summaries, the review sessions within each of the units very helpful. They also found that terminology and language, which is a big thing in the field of inclusive education, helpful because it was provided as in summary form and as a glossary. Crucially, where we saw the biggest shifts in terms of the teachers, student teachers, because we did a baseline and endline, was particularly around their knowledge and particularly around their skills. In the knowledge, both distance and residential student teachers told us that from the time the materials and the programs was initiated in the institution to the time we came back to them to ask them the questions about the usefulness of knowledge, they found that the materials had improved their knowledge. It had improved the knowledge about how to deal with behavioral problems in their classrooms, for example. It had improved their knowledge about how to deal with learning difficulties. Crucially from our point, because part of what we were trying to assess was the extent to which a more holistic and comprehensive model of social inclusive education is promoted in teaching and learning. They said that the knowledge about what social cohesion means for your teaching improved over time. And this is important in a country riven by extensive conflict and misunderstanding, but fundamentally conflict. We don't have to look too far and read too much in current newspapers to see why understanding of social cohesion in the classroom and having a human rights approach into our education system is important. For the competencies, students reported very positive views. Obviously, I'll make the qualification just now, but for example, they felt that over time, their competency for understanding the needs of children with disabilities improve over time. They also pointed out that the program supported them in making them more aware of the importance of human rights in education. They also felt they were able to better deal with the policies such as screening, identification, assessment, and support, the CS recommendation. They also felt that over time, they were better able to understand how to manage conflict in the classroom and differentiate. A big health warning here, we make it very extensively in our report. From the time we did the baseline to the time we did the end line, there was a short space of time. So when we talk about shifts, these are trends. They're not statistically significant, and they're not major. They're not statistically very big, partly because of the short duration. But crucially, they're illustrative of a trend. And the trends they illustrate for us is that the student teachers over time told us they gained the necessary disposition, knowledge, and skills to implement inclusive education as future teachers. They experienced positive shifts in their disposition, recognizing that people did, and this is the thing, while the shifts weren't big, this was because they already had prior positive dispositions on many of the items. They felt empowered to challenge existing practices in schools. They felt they were able to better realize inclusive education in their teaching. They also felt they gained new knowledge, such as how they deal with reporting abuse, how they teach in multilingual settings. All of those positively tell us that the project as a whole seemed to be moving in the right direction. Again, as we talk in our recommendations later, this is an initial impact evaluation because we need more time, we need more data, and we need to follow the study longitudinally. Now, in terms of continuing teacher professional development or continuing professional development, CPD or CPDT, the project, what it succeeded to achieve during the duration of the time frame was begin to conduct a pilot workshop with existing teachers to find out what kind of materials make sense to them if they were going to be given materials around inclusive education. So the existing materials were piloted with teachers in the Western Cape. In the report, we talk about that in detail. In addition, we also track the implementation and the evolution of the development of the materials to the extent that we evaluated and assessed at the very end the workshops held with all the provinces, all the HEIs and other stakeholders to talk to them about the final CPD materials that were produced. Now, crucially, what came out from that workshop was that what all the participants at this workshop said was that the finalized CPDT materials were important because what they provided existing teachers with and what province felt quite excited about was they can have now materials to train all their teachers in inclusive education, and they can use the materials with their teachers in multiple ways, including as part of holistic training programs, as part of supporting professional learning communities in South Africa, which is a core priority of the Department of Basic Education and the provinces, as well as self-study by individual teachers. Crucially, they felt that the way the materials were designed and its content makes it suitable to use as part of the CPD point system for teachers. And every teacher watching this will be pleased to know that eventually, if you do these materials, you can use it as part of your 150 points you need over a 3-year period to attain your professional development targets. Clearly, we're unable to understand the impact of how these CPD materials are being implemented because that falls outside the time frame we had for writing the report and the project itself. But what it does augur is that the materials had been consultatively developed with institutions and provinces over time, and that there are now in processes and plans in place to implement them. Now, I'm going to do two things for the last part of the presentation. Just give you a high-level macro synopsis of the achievements. Obviously, and then I'll talk about some of the recommendations, because clearly there are things to improve, there are things to pay attention to. Just the achievements of the project at the macro level. There's been the successful integration, but albeit in very diverse ways across higher education institutions. The materials are ready to use it for CPD purposes, but its impact is unknown at this stage. The macro impact is also that the project succeeded in developing system coordination, building robust and durable participation, and preparing the groundwork for institutionalizing change in initial teacher education and ongoing teacher professional development to ensure that inclusive education is considered a core priority of education. The implementation strategy supported the development of a common approach and understanding of mainstreaming inclusive education in initial teacher education and very likely in CPD. And this is important because what is required, particularly for those who train teachers as an institution, is to develop a shared common understanding of what inclusive education. That doesn't mean all institutions have to agree and follow the same understanding, but at least they have to share it. And that is crucially connected that through the project, what we noticed was the beginning and emergence of a community of practice amongst university lecturers who are implementing the program. It is hope, and we point out the difficulties of realizing this in the recommendations, that this is an important gain which needs to be sustained. We also realized and note the implementation strategy initiated mechanisms for regular contacts between and within government, as well as between government and other stakeholders, breaking down silos which previously hindered work in inclusive education. We think that the work we've done has several as evaluation from an evaluation point of view now. It contributed, albeit in a small way, to research on inclusive education in South Africa, regionally and globally. We call upon many researchers and higher education institutions to take up the research and build the knowledge base for evidence-informed inclusive education policy making. We think it's crucial to continue to capacitate and incentivize teacher education, particularly lecturers at higher education and particular early career researchers, to conduct research in the field of inclusive education. And we've learned a lot about the tools, techniques, and approaches we can use to research the field. And that is another unintended benefit, and hopefully that's something we will realize over time, and we will make the tools and techniques, once finalized, available to everybody. Now, as a way of thinking through how we might take this forward and understanding some of the challenges, we came up with several recommendations for the future. First, in terms of the learning resources, we say that sustaining the gains made with the development of inclusive education materials and resources requires continuous monitoring of the implementation to inform content updates. In other words, we need to regularly review the materials. The biggest risk of well-designed resources like this is that over time they ossify and they remain the same. We need to figure out how we continuously update it in a collective and participatory way, as has been the case in this project. How do we continue monitoring and begin to monitor the CPD implementation by provincial education departments, higher education institutions, and other stakeholders? We haven't done enough of that, and we haven't even begun to do that. How do we continue to do it? At the same time, how do we continue monitoring the long-term and longitudinal effects and impacts of the materials? Because what we monitored was the first year of the implementation of this materials amongst initial teacher education institution. We think it's crucial that next year and subsequent years, evaluation continues. How do we ensure that happens? We said that the system had begun to build robust and durable partnerships and enhance coordination. But these don't happen. These need to be sustained, and there are challenges. This different understanding between partners, different understandings between entities. How do we ensure that we sustain the gains by nurturing mechanism for cross-departmental coordination between government entities, within government departments, and between governments and other stakeholders, including universities and NGOs and civil society organizations? How do we continue stakeholder dialogue forums regarding the institutionalization of inclusive education and the materials that were developed? Crucially, we all know how important it is to have communities of practice, but we also realize how difficult it is to sustain them over time. When an intervention is there, they are sustained. We need to find out how we sustain the gains by figuring out and institutionalizing communities of practice over time. Third recommendation is about institutionalizing change in ITE, which is initial teacher education and continuing teacher professional development. Commitment requires how do we ensure that teacher education providers, all 23 and not just the 10 we worked with, continue to integrate the materials at an institutional-wide level, not just in one program, but across all their program offerings, whether that's in the BEd or the PGC level. How do we ensure that we institutionalize and support provincial education departments to continuously implement the materials, but crucially to extend the training and inclusive education for not just in-service teachers, but allied staff who work in the field. This includes teaching assistants, therapists, health support specialists. We have a lot of allied professionals who also support the removal of barriers to learning for young children. How do we ensure that the training reaches them? Recommendation 4 is crucially, ultimately, effective implementation is reliant on frontline and what we in the report call street level implementers. That is your lecturers and in the college, your student teachers undergoing training, and your teachers in the school. How do we ensure that those street level implementers fundamentally implement the materials, are empowered to do so, are supported to do so, and have the professional autonomy and agency to do that? To sustain such gains and to promote teachers and lecturer agency, we need ongoing professional development for lecturers and teachers in general, but specifically in inclusive education. We need to support lecturers with giving them the skills to monitor, to research their own practice, to understand how they're deploying the materials in their training and how they can improve the deployment of the materials. We need to figure out how we continue to sustain these communities of practice across all universities involved in teacher education, both distance and residential. But crucially, we want the institutions themselves to create enabling, productive, and meaningful institutional climates to encourage lecturers to adapt and integrate materials meaningfully. Recommendation 5 is an important one. This project had a twin-prong approach to inclusive education when it came to teachers. First, it focused on those who are becoming teachers, for which much of the report is devoted to, but crucially, we mustn't forget the teachers who are already in practice. Collectively, South Africa has over 400,000 teachers. How do we ensure that we have effective synergy and integration between initial teacher education and continuing professional teacher development? In the report, we talk about the challenges of sustaining this by realizing synergy between initial teacher education and continuing professional teacher development. For this, we talk about several things, including continued coordination and dialogue between those training teachers initially and those who are responsible for training existing teachers. How do we ensure that the materials continue to be aligned to the needs of newly qualified teachers, a group who often get neglected in our thinking? And we are positively encouraged that the Department of Basic Education is talking about an induction program for newly qualified teacher. What we'd like to see more of in sustaining this is how inclusive education is integrated into such programs. Obviously, being a researcher, there will be a key recommendation in the report about further research. We clearly think that we've made a small dent in understanding better from a research point of view and an evaluation point of view how inclusive education is institutionalized. And we believe that we have contributed, albeit in a small way, to encourage and nurture a culture of evidence-informed policymaking in education and in society in general. But to sustain these gains requires several things. First, financial support for future research, particularly targeted at new and early career research. We do need to bring into the system young researchers and early career researchers in the field. We need to continue the support for organizations such as British Council and others, and government entities to facilitate long-term monitoring and evaluation. We need to work with the Department of Basic Education and Department of Higher Education to embed the monitoring of inclusive education in their programs in whatever ways they do, for example, in SNAP surveys or general EMIS data. We also need to, and this is one thing we realize we haven't done enough of in our work, we need in-depth, detailed, rigorous, qualitative research to answer the question, why do people change their views? Why do they change their practice? And how does this actually work out in practice in schools? In the time we had and the resources we had, we weren't able to do enough of that. And we certainly think going forward, we need to do that. Let me conclude by a few remarks. We believe that our evaluation of the Teaching for All program affirms a valuable lesson about implementation. It affirms that successful education outcomes from any intervention requires close attention to how things are implemented as much as what you intend to do. In this respect, consultation, dialogue, collaboration, piloting, and capacity building are some of the key ingredients to successful education reforms. And as such, ensuring an effective process of implementation requires attentions to these aspects as much as it requires attentions to the targets and goals set for education reform. We conclude by developing what from the research and the approach taken in the project, a model of inclusive education that we visually capture in the last slide that you'll see on the presentation, which has 4 key ingredients: intergovernmental coordination and governmental coordinations between statutory bodies, good quality materials and learning resources, ITU providers and lecturers working together, as well as CPD providers and teachers working together, teachers and schools as sites of practice. Those 4 ingredients put together enable us to develop inclusive education system so that we work towards developing a better, more equitable, more just society in which our policy commitments made in White Paper 6 is that no one shall be denied the right to education, irrespective of their race, religion, creed, learning barrier, or disability. I thank you for the chance you've given me to share with you, albeit in a synoptic overview, the key findings of our reports. But I hope I encourage you to read the report, encourage you to engage with the materials, and come back to me with further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Syed, for a fascinating feedback session. Now, of course, for a more detailed perspective, reading this report is a must. But if there was any key takeaway, Prof, what in terms of like the core concept that you would want every inclusive educator to focus on, what would that be?
Okay. This is obviously a difficult and challenging question, but the key takeaway would be in simple, that every educator involved in inclusive education need to have the required knowledge, skills, and what we call in the report values, attitudes, and belief, to believe that every child, irrespective of race, class, gender, or learning barrier or disability, has the right to learn and has the potential to learn. And it's up to the educators, supported by well-governed and efficient education system, to make that happen in the classroom, in the school and in the society at large.
I must say, Prof, I am extremely jealous about this report and this work that you are doing. And I'll tell you why. I matriculated 10 years ago. So I was in school about 10 years ago, right? And I'm looking at the key findings that were made in this report. I'm looking at the work itself, right, and what it promises for the future of education in South Africa. And it pains me that we were not part of, this started when some of us were already out of school. And there's so much that could have, impacted the way in which we view the world when we went into universities and so on. So I really do think that with regards to that, in as much as though I am very saddened that we did not benefit from this, I've got a younger brother who is in high school right now and who definitely will be a beneficiary of this inclusive education, which is so critical in South Africa, as you have said, because our country is one that is very deeply polarized and has got very, serious levels of inequality that we see on a daily basis. But I wonder, though, like also in terms of some of the salient observations that you made in the collating of this data, as pertains to the very nature of, some of the social or societal challenges that the education system in South Africa faces, what were some of those for you?
I guess our focus was, to an extent, we were mindful and aware of the salient social challenges, and the Inclusive Education Project and the Teaching for All project is meant to address that. And those salient challenges, take us back to the very heart of the constitutional commitments and the commitments we made in the National Education Policy Act in as far back as 1994, 5, and 6 onwards. And those are the commitments to ensuring that any form of race-based discrimination, any form of discrimination around language, or any form of discrimination that denies every child the right to equitable and quality education is eradicated and overcome. And we're placing emphasis in the report on teachers and their agency to ensure that it happens and relies. I think we need to bear this in mind that roughly since 1994, we've had 2 cycles of learners, assuming they were born in 1994, who completed a full cycle of schooling, assuming at 12 years. So we're currently into our 3rd cycle of children who are, if you like, going to schooling post-1994. And I think what we can learn from this report is that your brother and anybody who's coming into the school now, hopefully in the 3rd cycle, we can ensure that the school is more inclusive now than it's ever been in the last 2 years. So I think it's about how do we get practical measures and how do we get the practices in the classroom that teachers can use so that we don't have incidents or attitudes or actions in classroom that single out learners either because they have a learning barrier or because they talk differently, they look differently, they think differently. In other words, how do we make the classroom a warm, inviting, and crucially pedagogically inclusive environment? Because fundamentally, inclusive education relies in what teachers do, or more importantly, what they don't do in the classroom. And our report is a call for ensuring that they do more of inclusive education rather than less, and it's not limited to one subject. Whether you're teaching maths, history, science, across all the subjects, your attitudes and your pedagogies need to be inclusive. And I guess that's the one thing that strikes us as responding to the social challenges you speak about.
Ladies and gentlemen, please do feel free to engage in this Q&A. We look forward to a dynamic dialogue with you. I'll ask Prof another quick question to give you all the time to submit your questions. Now, Prof, in your presentation, you speak of fostering a disposition towards inclusive education, right? Given that disposition is such a very dynamic concept, how would you define ground and embed it pragmatically? How does that look like in the classroom?
In very simple terms, disposition is a bundle of values, attitudes, and beliefs. In simple terms, we want every educator to believe that every child can achieve. So maths is not reserved for boys only, for example, or if you're black, you can't think conceptually. It's those kinds of things we want to address. So it's about how we change those values, beliefs, so that both in terms of the beliefs teachers have and the attitudinal responses and reactions to learning in the classroom, that's what we want to shift over time. And what the report says is student teachers do make those shifts, And they do start with, to some extent, with those positive dispositions. The question is, why isn't it sustained over time? The question is, why isn't it better realized in the classroom? And that is where professional development for teachers come into play. So for me, and for the report, we do believe that it is possible. And in very concrete terms, it's manifested in what you say, how you say what you say, but also how you teach. You don't ask girls only or boys only questions. You rearrange a class to ensure that everybody has the right to talk and everybody's encouraged to talk. So it's those kinds of very simple things, but important ways that affirms the values and beliefs that you hold dear in your inclusive education pedagogy.
So in your presentation, Prof, you speak of, a need for far more research to be done, right, to improve the overall knowledge base for inclusive education. So in your opinion, which are, some of the most dynamic fields of research that you think are urgently required?
Well, I think what our report points to is that we've done this large scale, to an extent, surveys quantitative. So methodologically, I'd like to see more in-depth, nuanced, textured, fine-grained analysis of why people change, how they change, and how do they enact in inclusive education pedagogies. In particular, what I'd encourage us to do is try to find in the education systems not only models of why things fail, but positive affirming models of inclusive education pedagogies that is evidence-based and that's not purely anecdotal, and write that up as research. So I'd like to see more positive stories, and through the research we engage on in further work.
And you also speak about, institutionalizing the change that fosters inclusive education, right? So where do you see the greatest challenges and opportunities that are lying in fostering this multifaceted institutionalization?
Well, let's break that question down. In higher education, institutionalizing this change relies on, for example, ensuring that if you're working in a faculty of education, it's a faculty as a whole that has an inclusive education project. It's not limited to a department of inclusive education or a group of academics who are in the field. So I'd like faculties of education to talk collectively about inclusive education as a core priority of all their training, but crucially to model in their own faculties the inclusive climates that I would like to see teachers enter into in future. So that's one level of institution. Going further up, that's at the higher level of senior management, faculty management, right very to the heart of vice chancellors. The challenge must be thrown to DVCs of research and vice chancellors. What is it your institution is doing about promoting the kinds of transformation we need to see in education, not just in teacher education, but across all your disciplines, across all your fields? I mean, ambitiously, every higher education student, irrespective of your field, should have an orientation to understand what it means to live in an inclusive society underpinned by the constitutional values of South Africa.
So I found something very curious in your report, Prof, right? And you obviously work with a number of institutions of higher learning, right? Almost kind of like as a pilot for this project, right? And the curious thing about it is that these education institutions all have got very different backgrounds, right? Historical backgrounds, political backgrounds, economic backgrounds, as it were, right? You did not only look at so-called middle class or historically white or historically black institutions. And yet there are some very interesting findings, right, about the attitudes and the worldviews of these, the participants, the initial, teacher educators in particular. And I'm curious to find out, why is it that we are seeing in terms of the outcome of the, the benefits that were received from this project, despite all of these, multiplicities of backgrounds and material conditions that characterize these institutions. Why do we see almost the same outcome, the same perspective in terms of what?
So that's an interesting question. In the report and the companion report, we do look at the disaggregated data. I mean, obviously sample sizes are small. There are some differences. They're not significant, but there are differences by institutional type. There are some differences between universities of technology, and what one would call traditional universities. So there are some of those differences. But I think what's the more macro picture is that in one level, after you factor out institutional histories and background, the challenge of inclusive education is a common one across all 10, and I would hazard a guess, because we haven't done the research, across all 23. And it's almost been, and in a sense, the social model of inclusion and a human rights and social justice approach to teacher education more generally, I would argue, has been lacking across all 23, almost equally, albeit very differently. And that's the big takeaway for me. And I think the report asks each of the 23 education providers to introspect and ask themselves, to what extent do their teacher education program prepare the next generation of teachers, because they're also in the third cycle of training to an extent for the kinds of teachers we want for the third cycle of learners in our system, if you use 1994 as the starting date.
So, Prof, you also speak about teachers who, through this inclusive education skills development process, have become empowered to challenge existing systems in schools, right? What are some of these, existing edifices that you believe must be challenged most urgently, and how would that be done?
In very simple terms, that would be first, challenging those structures within the school to ensure that at the school level, that you are able as a teacher to promote the kinds of pedagogies that's inclusive. But fundamentally, it would be about challenging school-level policies like the code of conduct policy, or to check whether your school has an anti-racist policy, or whether your school has a policy to deal with the gender-based violence. And that's where those are the kinds of practices I hope future teachers and existing teachers challenge. But it's also at a peer level challenging your colleagues and your peers. If you feel that they may be doing better in terms of inclusive education and you've received the training, it's also challenging. So it's multifaceted. It's also working with the parents who are part of the school community or the carers and working with them to promote the inclusion you want.
Prof, we've got a question here from some few questions for you here from the audience,
Okay.
right? The first one is, what is your view on project-based learning as a way of creating learning experiences that are inclusive of many different dispositions and abilities?
Okay, so my simple answer and short answer, because hopefully you don't, project-based learning is a tool. It's a method of teaching. It's not so much what project learning is about. It's about what goes in project learning. Whether you do teaching as a whole class teaching or active-based learning or group work or project-based learning, for me, that's not the issue only. The issue is whether that pedagogic approach is inclusive. For example, you could have project-based learning, but if you have it's racially segregated, then it's undermines project-based learning. If you don't have project learning, project-based learning, which mixes the abilities of all learners, so you don't stream learners as school do into projects for high-achieving learners, medium, average, however defined, then for me that's a self-defeating object in a sense. So it's not about the pedagogy, it's about how you operationalize the specific technique in terms of your original question, the values that you think are important for inclusive education.
So you're speaking in your presentation, Prof, about the need for a more longitudinal study into this, right? Because that's how we are going to get the essence and the substance of both the value of this project, but also the change that it creates in society. And I think this question is related in part to that, right? One of the audience members asks you, what are the support mechanisms and resources from all state agencies and departments that should be put in place to ensure that new and current teachers in poor schools can deliver on the model of inclusive education equitably across communities in the long term?
I mean, I think we do have some of the tools, and part of what we're saying is if we think of the tools as policies as well, it's about realizing it. So, for example, we have inclusive education teaching standards. So we have that. The question is, how do we use that to judge the efficacy or assess the performance of teachers? I'd like to see a model where we have a more holistic teacher performance management system that is not narrow in orientation, but as part of the performance management of teachers, we also look at how they teach inclusively. I should, as a professor, lecturer at a university, be judged by the extent to which my teaching approaches are inclusive of whether it's those students with learning barriers or diverse backgrounds, diverse religious backgrounds, and I think that should be part of it. So for me, that's some of the tools. I think simple tools like schools that welcome every languages. I noticed in one of the comments on the inbox, there was make posters in every language available in schools. And those go around affirming identities. And I think that's part of it and as well, I think.
Okay, so I'm going to this one last question,
Sure.
which I find to be quite a very interesting one, right? Given the nature of conversation in South Africa around teachers and the amount of work that they are doing and the lack of support that they often receive or don't receive from various institutions, right? The question says, teachers often tell us that they are overwhelmed with all the demands made on them in classroom situations. Did the study look at whether especially the practicing teachers who engaged with the materials felt less overwhelmed and more confident to tackle diversity in general and the participation of disabled learners in particular within their current practice? Do we know what they found most useful?
Okay. So there are two parts to this question. We didn't study teachers per se, but from the pilot study and the discussions with teachers when we're looking at the CPD material, what comes out very clear is that teachers feel helped and supported when there are well-designed materials that meet their needs, as opposed to materials that don't meet their needs. So I think that's a helpful thing for teachers. But I think the other part to the question is that I don't think the report is suggesting, or if it is, it should suggest that this is yet one more thing teachers should be doing. Teachers do a lot, right? But I think it does ask the question, and this is a talk back to the various departments, what is it that we think is the core of what good quality teachers are and what good quality teachers do and what quality teaching is in an equitable way? And if we have to remove some of the things from what teachers do in order to embed priorities like inclusive education, human rights, then that must be. Taking in a global perspective, India, for example, in this new national education policy, realized that there's no point making teachers election monitors, much as that's a good idea. It distracts from fundamentally ensuring equity in the classroom. Take that away in India. In South Africa, we need to ask, do we have too much administration, too much burden? So we need to ask ourselves what quality and equitable teacher is and teaching is, and key into that and remove those other barriers.
Thank you so very much, Prof. I think, it's extremely, very profound. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated a lot of, inequalities that are already pre-existing in South Africa. And I find that one of the issues that we are probably going to deal with in the post-COVID society, right? And it's obviously not going to be the same in many ways as the one that we lived in before. One of the issues that is going to be exacerbated, right, as more people have lost jobs, more, the economy has been battered and so on, that we're probably going to see quite a lot of tensions arising in communities, right? And schools are a microcosm of those communities, right? Issues around xenophobia, for example, issues around racism, and quite a number of other issues that arise as a result of, contest for, economic resources, for social placing and so on. We're going to see quite a lot of these emerging. And I think that, having teachers who are trained to be able to identify these, but to also be able to deal with them in the classroom does far more work for our country beyond just the classroom space into the communities as well. And I think for me, having read this report and thinking about it in the context of that post-COVID reality, I feel almost, a bit less uneasy about what the future looks like in our classrooms and in our community. I feel less uneasy about, our readiness as a community to tackle some of the, very problematic, systematic and institutionalized problems that our country often faces. So I think for me, at that level, this report is very profound for this and for easing, giving that level of ease to the fears of the tensions that we might be seeing arising in 2021 and beyond. Thank you very much for this, Prof. And ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our live Q&A with Prof. Syed. We are very grateful for your time today, Prof, and your tireless ongoing efforts and the incredible body of insight that your report and presentation have given us. I'm sure that having whet our audience's appetite so eloquently, your report will become an enjoyable and inspiring holiday read in the coming weeks. It points to a future of very huge potential, and we are hugely grateful for the work that you have done. And it has been a wonderful opportunity to share this morning in your company. And to you, our audience, thank you very much for your engagement, for your very, very impressive and profound questions. And please do stay online with us. We're now going to go into a live panel discussion. Professor Syed has laid a very formidable groundwork for discussion this morning, and we are very grateful to him, and we thank him profusely for it. We will now take a short break, but please don't go anywhere. We'll be back. Dumelang, re a leboga, welcome back. Now, to take the discussion further, please help me welcome our panelists for today, joining us remotely via a secured Zoom link. Ms. Jean September is the Deputy Director of the British Council of South Africa in the Lower Third. Ms. Millicent Boaduo is the Department of Basic Education Chief Education Specialist and Early Childhood Interventionist. And Dr. Sina Musito is the Head of Department of Foundation Phase and Intermediate Phase Departments in the Faculty of Education at the Cape Peninsula University of Technology. Thank you very much, for you joining us here. Now, before we begin this panel discussion, please feel free to submit any questions that you have to the panel via our online traffic system, and we look forward to exciting interactions around the launch of the report today. With human rights as our backdrop and Professor Syed's feedback at the top of our minds, allow me to kick off the conversation with the following question to our panel. When it comes to ending structural discrimination and addressing inequalities in the education system by encouraging participation, the notion of communities of practice to drive forward inclusive education feels quite fundamental. But yet, how does one create, foster, and develop such communities as part of an integrated approach across the education system? And I'll ask you, Sina.
Thank you. Look, it's very easy to be overwhelmed, when it comes to thinking of establishing such networks. But I believe that one should start small, start where you are, because very often we overlook the spaces within which we are. For example, Professor Syed explained that when you talk about inclusive education within schools of education, it shouldn't only be about departments that are teaching inclusive education or doing research in that kind of, platform. So you have to be thinking about ways in which we can bring together the whole faculty to really rethink the extent to which how we teach is inclusive, and also the extent to which the content is, delivered in such a manner that our student teachers are prepared for the larger, a community of inclusivity out there. So that's within where I am as far as the faculty is concerned. But I think also as somebody who's within, a school of education, I also have the benefit of reaching out to schools, because we do a lot of work with schools, whereby we send our students for teaching practice. And through those kind of relationships, I have to find, a space through which I can initiate collaborations, because there's always a need for us to talk to teachers about what we are doing, and of course to avail ourselves where necessary. For example, one of the projects that we are doing in the faculty, we were asked to work with one of the schools. It's something that I initiated to really help them to make sense of the policy of SEERS. And so that project has actually been a very useful project through which our students were involved. We also understand what is happening in schools. Schools are also feeding back to us in terms of what else we can do in terms of carrying the whole issue of inclusion forward. So I would say start small, scan your environment before you go out there, because it doesn't help to really go out there when you're not even when you're not working within what your environment needs and avails. Thank you.
The inequalities in the education system have, increased rather dramatically as a result of the pandemic. Millicent, what is it that we need to do to recover and build it back better?
Thank you so much, Malaika. I think that is one pertinent question that has come out even way before COVID-19. And I think COVID-19 has just exacerbated this issue. But I think what is very important is the issue of collaboration. If anything has taught us, well, we're starting this project, issue of collaboration of stakeholders of different skills, knowledge, aptitudes, coming together and sharing information, but also using these skills to bridge the gaps that the system has. I think the education system needs to make sure that we bring on board all our stakeholders together and we actually appreciate opinions and values that all these different stakeholders bring to the table. If more than ever, no man, no woman, no entity can work on their own to achieve anything within the education system. If we talk about a holistic approach, you're talking about that child that exists within a community, that exists within a school environment, that exists with a teacher, with anyone. So every entity needs to come together to work together to bridge those gaps. And collaboration, for me, I think it's very important and will actually sort out a lot of these issues that we actually come across. One of the issues we all usually deal with within the education system is just the curriculum. But the curriculum is not just about the teacher. The child in the classroom may have a learning barrier, and it's about the healthcare professionals that are embedded within the education system that collaborates with that teacher to help the teacher as well. We also have other stakeholder parent organizations that are embedded within the community to make sure that the programs that are delivered at the school for that learner, for that child, is sustainable and it's ongoing when they exit the education system and they go back to the existing communities. And it's that long chain that we talk about, that we need to make sure that these collaborative partnerships exist, they are strengthened, and that they never lost within these linkages as well, so that wherever we go, anywhere we go, we pick up these linkages, these collaborative systems, and make sure these programs are sustainable. Thank you.
So, Jean, you are obviously with the British Council, and perhaps this question might be a bit repetitive, but it would assist us in getting a far more detailed perspective on the work that you are doing, right? So Prof has said, and we recognize from our reading of this report, that we all have a role to play in building an equitable and quality education system for all learners, right? What is your role, Jean, and the role of your organization, right, as the British Council? What commitments can you make today that you can be held to, right, with regards to the promotion of this inclusive and transformative education?
Yeah, thank you, Malaika, for the question, and just thank you to all those who are participating today in this webinar. And we certainly don't see this as the end of the process. We're on a journey, and we've been on this journey for 4 years with the Teaching for All project. But also beyond that, in our organization, the British Council, we have embedded inclusion within our program work, but also as an organization, to have an organizational culture that is inclusive, that is fair, and we work with different communities around the world where we have offices. So it's very much part of who we are and what it is that we do. So Teaching for All for the past 4 years has been a huge step in our own development in terms of how we engage with education partners, how we engage with the ministries of education, and also looking at how do we begin to build this and extend the network of practitioners working in inclusive education. And although Professor John Volmick is not with us today, he did send a little note in terms of what he would like to include in this discussion as well. And he was saying that there is no real sort of holistic understanding of inclusive education. It's still a very new kind of concept, and it requires quite a lot of advocacy, communication, training, and support. We had an education system in South Africa where it excluded. Now we are looking at how do we begin to build an education system that is inclusive. It's not going to happen via osmosis or any way, it's hard work. But I think what the 4 years have shown us is that we've got partners in South Africa and also in the UK who can certainly work together and strengthen what it is that we've got. So even when Yusuf talks about M&E, yes, there are lots of tools that we can use in terms of what was developed during the past sort of 4 years. And now it's a question of how do we as partners, as well as the participating universities, how do we continue this journey? And as a British Council, we're very keen to do that. We do it in some of our other works. And I think the lesson that we learned through this was that we're doing little bits and pieces around inclusion in our siloed ways of working. So what the pandemic has also sort of taught us is that we need to integrate what we do a lot more and work together, and so that we can create sort of bigger impact in terms of what we're doing. So going back to what John Volmink was saying, he also then said, what kind of people do we want to see coming out of our schooling system, and what kind of teacher, curriculum, and educational ethos will be needed in order to produce such people? So I think the challenge is there for us to take forward as a group of people who've worked together. And it's not been all sort of, easygoing. We've had our ups and downs, but at least at the end of 4 years, we can all sit together in a room and we can talk about the journey that we've been on so far, but also how do we take this forward. And if I can maybe just end off by saying all learners matter, and they matter equally, and all good teachers teach inclusively. So I don't think it's a whole lot of extra work we are looking at, but how do we use the resources that we actually have? And teachers play such a crucial role in terms of being the heart of what it is that we do in our classrooms. So sorry, I'll end there.
Prof, I'm going to direct this particular question to you, right? In your presentation, you spoke a lot about a lot of the transformative work that needs to happen, in some of the cognitive factors of education, and even as well as non-cognitive, right? The societal or the social matters, as it were. And I'm reading this question from a student. His name is Thabo Mufolo from the Cape Peninsula University of Technology. And he's asking a question that I think is very important, right? In light of the fact that, the COVID-19 pandemic, we tend to speak about it and its impact on education at a very material level, right? We talk about, how it exposed inequalities in terms of, material resources and so on, how it exposed inequalities in terms of the, socio-economic backgrounds of learners and so on. But there's a very interesting, question that Thabo poses, and this is about the mental health of students, right? And that is something we ought to be thinking about when we're thinking about inclusive education as well, right? He's asking about, what are some of the recommendations that we can give to schools that seek to be inclusive and to be diverse in terms of, what are the strategies that they can utilize in maintaining inclusion and in generally assisting students who are battling with, mental health problems as a result of this pandemic. How does the classroom look like for those learners?
I think Tabo's question is really welcome, because in this report and other work, I think what COVID is telling us more than ever is why we need a more expanded notion of education quality that doesn't only focus on content and cognitive learning, but also focuses on the psychosocial elements of learning and the well-being of learners. And if I can just expand Tabo's question just a little bit more, it's not about the well-being of learners only. It's also about the well-being of teachers and student teachers, because teachers are members of the community. Their families are impacted with COVID. Their children themselves are impacted by COVID. They have relatives. So it's about how we ensure that in both in initial teacher education, ongoing professional development, we not only take care of teachers' well-being and provide them with the required support, but also empower them with the skills, the knowledge, and the disposition to support the well-being of learners who would have suffered trauma of different kinds. For example, poorer learners, their effects are real. They've been cut off from school feeding for some time, for example, or they've been cut off from engaging socially with other learners, because not all learners can learn equally at home, given the disparities. And learning is as much about the social dimension of learning as about the cognitive dimension. So I think Tabo's question is spot on. And I think the kinds of things we speak about in the report in inclusive education is about having that expanded notion of education quality, so that every teacher and every learner is exposed to a broadened definition of education quality, which has at its core social and emotional learning and well-being of the learners as well as the teacher. And I think teacher unions and government have a big role to play in supporting and providing their teachers with the necessary support as much as the learners.
Millicent, I'm going to direct the same question to you, right? As the Department of Basic Education, earlier on in the year when we went into lockdown, and subsequently came out, there were some kind of restrictions and so on, and there was basically a model of how do we reintroduce learners at a phased level, right? Phase stages into coming back into education and so on. And teachers raised a number of the challenges that Thabo is speaking about, and that Prof also alluded to, right? About what they felt was particularly a lack of support for teachers and so on. And I'm wondering, what is it that, what does this look like for teachers? What does this inclusive education in this, COVID era, with teachers having anxieties about, contracting COVID, but also a lot of other anxieties that are happening in communities and in homes and so on. What is the Department of Basic Education, what is your thinking around this, and what is it that you are doing in terms of addressing this particular issue for teachers?
Thanks, Malaika. I think that was one of the biggest challenges the department was faced with, not just the well-being of the learners, but the individuals that are supposed to stand in front of these learners and deliver a curriculum, and not being able to meet those the end stages of the curriculum, of just finalizing the curriculum and giving that teaching that is supposed to do. We immediately thought that in order to make sure that the schooling environment almost returns to a calm effect, and not, one that is harsh or one that is full of anxiety, because we knew that was going to happen. We actually immediately connected with the Department of Social Development, and then also obviously the other departments that could provide psychosocial support to our educators immediately. We allowed the schools to form what you call the COVID-19 support system, or support teams, or groups where teachers would be able to come together and actually talk, obviously respecting the rules of regulations as well. But the issues of psychosocial support available for every single teacher in every province, every district, at provincial offices, district offices, was very important. And it brings us back once again to the issue of collaboration. The department knew that we don't have that capacity of humans to be able to provide the psychosocial support, the entities that our teachers and our learners and our parents, believe it or not, would need. So we made these connections with the Department of Health, Department of Social Development, to ensure that those that are qualified enough to be able to provide the counseling, the psychosocial support, would be immediately roped into the system, and in a centralized place where teachers could be tapped for that psychosocial support that they needed, and made sure that there's no red tapes where a teacher could just pick up the phone call and say, I am not doing well, I need help. Where can I go to? And those systems were actually available. Those individuals were available at the schools. We made them also available at the district offices as well, but of course made them available telephonically as well, where teachers and the school principals connect immediately to their provincial office, not having to observe all the different channels of individuals that they could communicate with. And I think that is very, very important. We talk about teachers not just being teachers alone, but having the adequate support that they needed as well. And that's when we had to rope in all these different entities to support them. And of course, parents as well that were willing to support their learners and then teachers as well. I talk about parent organizations that existed. I talked about civil society organizations that were there, and they were also roped into supporting our parents, supporting our teachers, which I think is very important, because once you have a healthy teacher, the teacher is able to deliver a healthy curriculum and speak to their learners as well very well. So I think that's one thing that the department immediately put in systems in place, that psychosocial support that are going to be needed. Thank you.
Sina, you are an HOD, right? You deal with issues around HOD rather in the space of foundation and intermediate phase, right, in the Department of the Faculty of Education at CPUT, right? And these are, you deal with, the training of teachers who are going to be dealing with very, very young students, right? And when I think about some of the issues or the topics that are, that come out a lot when we speak about inclusive education, issues around, how do we, how teachers are trained to, think of issues around violence, gender-based violence, and other forms of violence, issues around xenophobia, racism, and so on. I can see how you would engage that with teachers who are teaching this, much more senior secondary phase of education, right? And I wonder then, how does that look like for teachers? How do you, this language for teachers who are, dealing with very, very young children, for whom this language is not, it's not a common language for kids that are that young. So the training for those teachers is very important, because that is the early or the primary, levels of socialization are so very important for those teachers. But what does it look like? How can schools become more inclusive spaces, for teachers, for learners who are that very young?
Look, there are many ways of doing this. And I must say that inclusive education as a practice, it has been a lot more dominant in primary schools than in high schools in South Africa. I stand to be corrected by Millicent, of course. But I know that primary education has been on the forefront of a lot of inclusive, practices. Even long before we're talking about inclusion and we're talking about things like remedial education, you would find a lot of that in primary schools. So, and of course, it's something that you also take very seriously in our programs, both the foundation phase and intermediate phase. And so the question is, how do we train our student teachers to talk about those issues, which probably one would think are easy to discuss with learners who are at higher grades, like high school? I think there's always space for talking about, for example, violence to a foundation phase learner. The issue is for one to find a way of expressing it in a language that is developmentally appropriate without necessarily scaring those kids, because we really don't want them to be traumatized in terms of how we talk about these issues. But you can also not afford to leave them unattended, hoping that somebody will do it later on, because it does not mean that when you do not address them at primary school level through our primary school teachers, then everything is fine until they go to high school. And that's when, all the social ills that we know of, begin to show themselves. So our students are prepared in terms of the language of inclusion. They know exactly how to approach these young people, whether it's at the grade R level, as little as that, pre-primary, and even up to, grade 6, which is where intermediate phase ends. So the language, one of the issues that you deal with is language, appropriate language that is appropriate for the developmental level of the child that we'll be dealing with. And of course, one of the things that you're also interested in, for me personally, I always tell my students that before you engage with what others are doing, it's necessary for you to interrogate yourself as a teacher. You need to interrogate the assumptions that you have about other people, the beliefs that you have about other people, because very often we externalize, social ills, and we think they are out there when we are actually part of the out there. So it starts with really understanding who we are and how we are approaching those things, so that we can speak about them with, credibility, because it doesn't help to say one thing and then you do the other. And I must say, primary school teachers are very important people, because for many of our kids, across the board, I'm not just talking about schools of, where they're low socioeconomic status, parents are working. Most of the time, the children are with their teachers, and schools are seen as safe havens where these kids, find the safety and the kind of, caring and guidance that, ordinarily, they would be receiving from their homes. So our students understand the importance of this. And one of the things that we are doing at CPT, which we are taking very seriously, is to make sure that, for example, in our foundation phase program, which for many years people always associated foundation phase programs with only female teachers, we are taking into heart making sure that we also have role models who are male teachers in the foundation phase program, because we have many students who go to school in the foundation phase and, of course, who do not have male figures within their homes. So, and of course, the role of having a male teacher within the foundation phase program as an inclusion thing is also helping those boys and girls who do not have male figures. We have many single parent-headed homes in South Africa, especially with the absent male figure. So our parents are, having a male foundation phase teacher is going to serve, a purpose of having kids to see somebody that they can identify with, boy children, and who's going to be teaching them in terms of what it means to be a man from that early age onwards. And I know I've read some research which says that very often girls, for example, seem to do very well, at the foundation phase in terms of literacy and numeracy. And something seems to happen when they move into the higher grades, whereby now they're being taught by male teachers, and they don't seem to be doing so well in mathematics. And there's a claim that has been made elsewhere that maybe it's because at the foundation phase, they are not really getting to connect that much with male, teachers. And therefore, the more we have of those male teachers, it's going to break some of the barriers that probably make it difficult for girls to connect to a male teacher at a higher grade. So, and look, there are many things that I could talk about, but I think those for me are crucial examples that I can put out there in terms of what you are doing. It's changing the face of who is a primary school teacher, and also changing the face of who goes to different schools. We don't just choose schools that you go to, like the schools in the Rondebosch area, schools in Constantia, etc. We make sure that our students reach across the whole of Cape Town. They go to townships and everywhere else where their services are needed, so that they are prepared for what real South Africa is, because there's no guarantee that they'll be working in schools which are close to CPUT. They have to be prepared to work in communities that look like where they come from, and that starts with the kind of teaching practice schools that they go to. Thank you, Malaika.
Jean, so there's a question, Jean, from the audience, and I would like to pose it to you, right? And the question says, part of inclusion is about diverse sexualities, gender identities, and sexual orientations, right? There is a lot of resistance to comprehensive sexual education. What is the impact of this resistance on inclusive education?
I think it's all of that, because there's also, when we talk about sort of discrimination, there's also multiple discriminations. And so wrapped up in a learner, for example, the learner may be black, maybe and female, and Muslim, and disabled, etc. So I think when we deal with issues of people and learners being discriminated against in their schools, it can be a multiple discrimination. And it's a question of, do we have the teachers who are sensitized enough to recognize the diversity within the classroom among sort of their students? And do they have then the skills to manage that within their locus of control? So I think it's something we need to have more conversations. And I think what COVID has also allowed us to do is to reach more teachers via webinars like this, and have quite intimate conversations using these digital platforms to talk about those kinds of issues, because we see it in our high schools also. There are issues around race. There's issues around skin color, around the type of hair that you've got, and what styles you can wear or not to school. So I think there are lots of issues which some people may be biased towards or stereotype it, that I think we need to bring into, and it's part of inclusive education, because we are also arguing that you need to cater for all your students in your classroom, irrespective of what the differences are. And I think that's the big challenge for all of us. And I think it's a lot around communicating that, talking about it, having opportunities where we can actually get together and talk about it. So quite a lot. One of our other programs that we run as well is instructional leadership for senior managers and the principals at school, where we concentrate on that the principal and the senior managers at those schools are responsible for the quality learning and teaching that happens in their school. The principal's role is not to sit in an office and do administrative work, but actually get into the classrooms and support teachers. So I think if we start looking at it in a far more holistic kind of way, inclusive education, it makes it a whole lot easier. It's not only about getting kids who have a disability into your classroom. It's not that at all. And I think we need to unpack what we mean by a social model of inclusive education, what we mean by changing the historical view of inclusive education only talks about disabled learners in our school. And I think those are the kinds of conversations we must have, including the conversations around sexual orientation, including the conversations around racial equality, including the conversations around gender. And I think we need to make space within this frame of inclusive education for all those elements as well.
Thank you. Prof, I'm going to conclude this panel discussion with a comment that has been posed, and I think it would be important for you to reflect on this. So one of the audience members makes this comment, says, this is a very important project. When conducting CPTD and capacity building, can you also consider to reach out to rural communities? Teachers out there need extensive support as they do not get enough support from the Department of Education.
That's a very good point. Let me just start that point by saying it's not just about CPD, it's also about initial teacher education. And it's also about inclusive education, just to build on the last response by Jean. Inclusive education must empower teachers to have difficult, challenging, and what one writer called dangerous conversations in our classroom with ourselves, with our learners, with our schools, with our government. Because if we don't have those conversations, we have the kinds of incidents we see daily in schools, whether that's around who gets invited to a party or doesn't get invited, whose hair matches the school's code and whose hair. And inclusive education also, therefore, in that kind of difficult and dangerous conversations, as Yancy says, is about reaching out to the parts of the education system that needs it the most. And those are disadvantaged communities and schools, as well as rural communities. So I think that comment is an important one, because you judge inclusive education by how every school manages it and not just some schools. And therefore, it's truly, just to build on what all the panelists, I think, are saying, inclusive education is about good quality teaching and good quality schools. But that's not something that's a preserve of a particular type of schools in a particular urban setting. It's about every school, and it's also about every teacher education institution, including UNISA as one of the larger providers of teachers. And I think we need to make sure that it's the system as a whole that reaches and gets support in inclusive education. Thank you.
Whew, what a profoundly interesting and a fantastic discussion. I mean, we could go on all day conversing about this, but unfortunately, our time is up. As we leave you with tons to think about and phenomenal findings to engage with, thank you to our panelists, to Professor Syed, and to all those who joined us today. The journey to inclusive education for all has really just begun, and today felt like a fantastic early step in manifesting intention into practice. So please, let's keep the conversation going. Give us your feedback on today's event. Stay in touch, and please go to our website to access the project materials, reports, and other vital resources, including this one that we were engaging on today. We look forward to a dynamic and inclusive collaboration with you. For now, thank you once again for being part of this, as we say goodbye and leave you with a short video that we request you to watch before signing off. We shall see you again soon. Le saleng hantle. Goodbye.
For as long as I remember, I've always wanted to be a teacher.
The moment that when I entered school gates, I felt like home for me.
For as long as I remember, I've always wanted to be a teacher.
The moment that when I entered school gates, I felt like home for me because I got love from the teachers.
My favorite teacher was Mr. Kali.
My teachers, they really played a big role in making me become who I am today.
One of the things that I think is amazing about student teachers who have gone through Teaching for All, it's this agency that I see seems to be emerging out of them.
The moment you join Teaching for All, it changes your perspective. You gain confidence to stand in front of a class and teach. There's a moment where you feel in control of the classroom. You have classroom management. Learners are with you.
Teaching for All as well teaches us how to involve, to build the relationship between the community. You cannot separate the school with the community because the behavior of the school is shaped by the behavior of the community.
Teaching for All encourages all teachers to listen to the needs of their learners and to also be flexible.
The fact that whether we like it or not, teaching is a calling of some sort. Not everybody will be a teacher. We may have all the degrees that you want, but we really need to interrogate the whole concept of who a teacher is and what does it mean to teach.
I would like to make every child in my classroom feel included.
Inclusive education can help to change our society.
As a young teacher, I'm really inspired to make a change for good.